Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning. It's a pleasure to have you attending this technical session on the baseline report on climate action in tourism. I'm Virginia Fernandez Trapa. I work as program officer at the World Tourism Organization. These technical sessions of the Glasgow Declaration, as many of you know, already are online events through which we try to bring relevant content closer to the signatories of the declaration and to others interested in climate action in tourism. We are organizing this series in the run-up to COP27. Next slide, please. Today's agenda will start with the welcome remarks from our director, Dr. Dirk Lesser, the director of the Sustainable Development of Tourism Department here at UNWTO. Then we will introduce the baseline report on climate action in tourism. We will have the opportunity to learn about the methodology that was followed to produce the report and the main takeaways from this project. And then we will look at the way forward, followed by a discussion, which we hope would be interactive. Next slide, please. Before I hand over to Dirk for his welcome remarks, I'd just like to remind you of the etiquette for Zoom, especially when it comes to staying muted, not to disrupt the flow, please. And if possible, kindly rename yourself by clicking, by using the right click of the mouse, if possible, to show your organization and then your name, as not everyone knows who is who, and in that way we can promote networking among us. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat throughout the session, and again during the Q&A, please make sure you transport every comment or question you have to us. We are recording, and if you stay with us, we understand that we have your consent to record. The video will then be disseminated in our website. And with this, I hand over to Dr. Dirk Lesser. Dirk, the floor is yours for your welcome remarks.
Virginia, thank you so much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. As you see, climate action is one of the top priorities for the World Tourism Organization, and the different events which we have prepared for and shared, the draft and documents are speaking for this commitment. The survey conducted in 2021 is today with the results, the main focus of our presentation and reflection. I wanted to thank in this context, especially the Adventure Travel Trade Association, which has from the beginning had committed themselves very strongly to this research. This research as such has inspired us and led to the technical brief on measuring tourism greenhouse gas emissions, which we presented last week for consultation. It was very inspiring, the insights we gained from this very first global survey. And I think everybody who participated with the insights, shared the insights and the analysis. With that, back to Virginia and to our colleagues.
Thank you so much, Dirk, for the welcome remarks. As you said, the baseline report on climate action in tourism basically presents the results of the global survey, which we conducted last year to better understand the ongoing climate action efforts of our sector. And this survey was conducted prior to the launch of the Glasgow Declaration, which, as you know, took place last November at COP26 to accelerate climate action in tourism, and that today counts over 700 signatories. It was over 1,000 stakeholders, including businesses, destinations, and organizations who participated in the survey and provided insights on ongoing mitigation and adaptation efforts, challenges related to measurement and planning, etc. Next slide, please. As Dirk mentioned, we developed this survey in partnership with a UNWTO affiliate member, the Adventure Travel Trade Association, and also collaborated with California State University, Texas A&M University, and Tourism declares a climate emergency. And I would also like to thank them all for their continued engagement in this project and their commitment to support our sector, the tourism sector, to accelerate climate action. Today, we have the opportunity to exchange with the team behind the scenes, the team behind the analysis of survey results, which led to the baseline report. And our colleagues will recap on the findings, the methodology, and again, I encourage you to engage in the Q&A and share your inputs. As we run up to COP27, it's interesting to see how the results of this work are aligned with the, let's say, activities being pushed by the Glasgow Declaration to support climate action. And with this, I'd like to hand over to Christina. Christina Beckman is the co-founder of Tomorrow's Air, which is a climate initiative of ATA. Christina, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Virginia. I also second the appreciation for this team, and thank you for the recognition. We've just had a wonderful time pulling this together with this group. So I'm Christina Beckman. I lead Tomorrow's Air, which is a carbon removal project incubated by the Adventure Travel Trade Association. I'm based here in San Francisco. It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce my colleagues, Dr. Paige Viren. She's the Executive Director for Sustainable Hospitality and Tourism Management at California State University, Monterey Bay. Prior to her current position, she was Associate Professor at San Francisco State University in the Department of Recreation, Parks, and Tourism. Dr. Viren has been conducting research on consumer behavior and tourism for more than 16 years, specializing in adventure travel and sustainable community-based tourism. She's also spent time working in the travel industry, where she specialized in adventure travel and earned several certifications, including Certified Travel Consultant and Certified Adventure Travel Specialist. So she really does understand the people that are part of this study. I think that Paige gives you great perspective in this work. And we also have with us today, soon to be Dr. Dan Pilgreen. He's a doctoral candidate within the Department of Recreation, Park, and Tourism Sciences at Texas A&M. His research focuses on human dimensions of natural resources, broadly examining the human-environment relationship through psychological and sociological theories. Dan's work specifically explores climate change and the influence of climate change on the human-environment relationship through the lenses of tourism and community resilience. So we really do have an all-star research team. I'm so happy to welcome you here today. I'll hand it over to Paige and then look forward to interrogating you at the end.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you, Virginia and the team with you.
Oh, Paige, sorry, go back. We have to talk about ATTA.
Yeah.
Sorry, guys. So just quickly about the ATTA. We're a UNWTO affiliate member, a vital leadership voice and partner for the adventure travel trade industry. Our organization was established in 1990. We have 30,000 some individual guides, operators, tourism boards, media around the world. We host events, a portfolio of events during COVID virtual, but now we're back live. And we have specialized expertise in research, education, media, and promotion. And then just briefly, our members are predominantly tour operators. We mentioned at the beginning, there was an initial survey. We did state of climate action in our own industry, surveying practitioners. So 50% of our membership is tour operators. We also have gear suppliers, accommodation, travel advisors, tourism boards, and media. Majority membership in North America and Europe. Latin America, we have growing communities in the Middle East and Asia. We're delighted to be part of the UNWTO and here today. Now I can hand it to Paige.
Thank you, Christina, for that introduction. And as I said, thank you to the UNWTO and our partners there. And, Dan Pilgreen, of course, has been pivotal in this research. So we're excited to finally be sharing some of the results and able to look to next steps moving forward. When we started this process, really, we wanted to come up with questions to understand more about just general topics really related to climate action and tourism, including climate action planning, greenhouse gas reduction, emissions measurement, climate adaptation, engagement of travelers in climate action. So the team worked together, and I think the real important part of the development of this survey was that although we identified priority stakeholder groups to be involved in the exercise, those are destinations, accommodation providers, transport providers, tour operators, and those providing experiences. There was input from all of the stakeholder groups in the creation of the survey instrument to try and get a baseline understanding, really, of where we are, what is kind of the state of climate in the tourism industry. Of course, it's difficult to measure all of the different parts of the tourism industry. So we worked with partners to design the questionnaire, and the goal of the questionnaire was really to identify existing policies, strategies, how people are measuring, or what measurement methodologies and initiatives are being used with regional, national, local, and other relevant tourism sectors. So we created the survey and decided to focus on the three stakeholder groups: business, destination, and supporting organizations. And it was a nested survey. So the survey was created, and then specific questions for each of those groups were focused on those groups. So it was sent out to those. The UNWTO, of course, academe, and then input from Tourism Declares, and all the various partners helped to create the survey that, of course, was translated into English, Spanish, and French. Next slide, please. So we tried to come up with a kind of a visual of the survey and how it was broken down. Somebody asking a question? No. So this visual kind of breaks up the way that we were looking at the questionnaire. The questionnaire, we were looking at policy, strategy, measurement, reduction, mitigation, adaptation, and engagement. And I think it's really key to point out that the questionnaire was refined with a series of collaborative meetings, and the final survey instrument that we used was a result of those meetings that we had. Questions to capture examples of tools and other types of actions businesses were taking to reduce emissions, changes in types of transportation use, changes in sources of energy, changes in approaches to sourcing food. And UNWTO, Tourism Declares, and ATTA, I think were really, their partnership was essential in coming up with a survey instrument. I think that was excellent. Next slide, please. So the survey distribution, it was a non-random chain referral sample to reach a broad scope of the tourism industry. It's difficult to come up with a set population of what is the tourism industry. So we worked with UNWTO and did a distribution across all of their member organizations, and we had over 1,100 completed responses, and from all of the UNWTO regions. Ideally in survey research, or in research, we would like to have a random sample so we can generalize results. But I think as a baseline study, or trying to kind of get a starting point for this, that this was the best route that we could follow, but it'll inform decision making in the future, which we would want to go ahead and create the have a specific population and draw the sample from there. And now I'm going to have Dan go ahead and share some of the results of the survey. If you want to go to the next slide, please. Oh, yes, I will add here that there were free text opportunities for the respondents. And I think that's one of the really telling items that we had many people that shared extensive, open-ended responses. So that will help with creation of survey instruments and follow-up research here. So quantitative and qualitative data were collected. Now you can go to the next slide. And now I'll have Dan share a little bit about the survey results.
Great. Thank you, Paige. First, I think it's important to really give context to what we're talking about. So we obviously tried to get as many people as we could from the regions across UNWTO. And importantly, this breakdown of who actually responded will kind of give you context to the overall takeaways that we have. So the global tourism industry is obviously a complex network of stakeholders. Breaking it down into 3 key stakeholders is kind of the best way to approach it, as this foundational study tried to do. And climate change, importantly, is impacting all of those stakeholders really collectively. So in this baseline study, it's important to take inventory of as many of these stakeholders as we can as possible. And so through this nested design, our very top level approach was through supporting organizations, businesses, and destinations. And so businesses were really the majority of respondents, about 60% of respondents related to business. So they would, to me, that kind of shows in general, there's some level at the business side of awareness of climate change and engagement with climate change. As part of the nested design, businesses incorporated tour operators, accommodation providers, and transport. Importantly, transport was somewhat lacking in response. So that still remains a large emitter within tourism that needs to be kind of ironed out a little bit more. For destinations and supporting organizations, they were almost equally represented for that remaining 40%, with destinations being slightly higher than supporting organizations. And so how we kind of grouped these 2 categories was destinations were primarily national, subnational, and local governments, as well as destination marketing organizations or destination management organizations. And so those kind of, we tried to collectively approach those as understanding the kind of complexities within the destination, whereas supporting organizations represent things like consultancies, networks, NGOs, things that are organizations that are responsible for supporting the efforts of destinations and businesses. And importantly, within the climate change context, is connecting these 2 and supporting their climate efforts. As UNWTO, if you could go back to the previous slide real quick, sorry. Yes, thank you. So UNWTO is obviously a global organization. And because of that and this global mapping approach, we want to be sure that we get as many regions as possible. I'm happy to say that all regions of UNWTO did respond to the survey. There were some that were a little bit less than others. So the primary regions that responded were Asia and Pacific, followed by Europe and the Americas. And then Africa, African organizations made up about 10%, and whereas the Middle East was only about 2%. So those are certainly areas where future research can kind of tailor this climate change experience. If you'll go to the next slide, please. So a complex phenomenon such as climate change takes significant effort. And that effort includes planning, it includes taking action to address climate change, and really preparing for a changing planet. A key aspect of that is thinking forward and creating a plan to adapt and overcome and address climate change. And so we unfortunately see that majority of organizations are engaging in climate action, which is a positive thing, that we see that organizations are wanting to engage with a changing climate and really help the industry become more sustainable. But unfortunately, they're not doing it through a formalized plan. So about a quarter of the respondents did have plans. 40% of supporting organizations had climate action plans, 30% of destinations, and only about 25% of businesses reported having a climate action plan. And importantly, part of addressing and adapting to climate change and creating an overall sustainable industry, it can be important to use experts within the field, mainly in organizational adaptation and sustainability, that can help move towards a more sustainable industry. And so we found that businesses and destinations with sustainability staff were more likely to have climate action plans than not having climate action plans. However, we did see that despite having sustainability staff, still about half were engaging with climate action through the sustainability staff without guidance of a plan. Certifications can also provide a foundation for pursuing climate action and achieving kind of predetermined standards of climate success. However, we did find that most businesses do not have climate-related certifications. There may be some connection between certifications and climate action plans. About half of those with certifications had a climate action plan, but that's still an area for future research. Next slide, please. And so addressing climate change is obviously a complex phenomenon, such as climate change takes a suite of actions to address. And so we attempted to kind of get this overall mitigation of climate change and the actions that they were taking to mitigate the impacts. And so the most reported mitigated actions were related to energy efficiencies, which we can kind of see as being kind of a top line thing, right? We're trying to transition away from fossil fuels, things like that. So using renewable energy resources, electricity and heating and cooling efficiencies were widely reported, and then using urban and kind of building improvements to make this transition towards a more sustainable energy use. Conservation related and waste management practices were also strategies that people use to engage in climate, or that organizations use to engage in climate change. But beyond those characteristics, there was really a steep drop off when it comes to other types of mitigation activities beyond these kind of high level, okay, we should be using LEDs and reducing waste and those kinds of things. The distribution of these mitigation practices were similar across all stakeholder types, with destinations reporting the least amount of engagement with mitigation strategies. So businesses reported the most, whereas destinations on the whole reported the least. And importantly, investment in collaborative efforts to address climate change can be an important avenue to address climate change overall within organizations. And our findings suggest that majority of respondents were not investing in these technological and nature-based solutions to climate change. Next slide, please. And so previous research suggests that about 8% of global emissions are related to tourism activities. And so therefore, the tourism industry certainly has a responsibility to address the impacts of these emissions. And despite our portion of the emissions that have been supported by research, we found that 3/4 of respondents were not measuring their greenhouse gas emissions. That's at the CO2 level or broader greenhouse gases beyond just CO2. So a key nuance to this measurement finding, however, is that there still remains kind of a knowledge gap of how to accurately account for and measure organizational emissions. So we found that 40% of organizations not measuring their greenhouse gas emissions were not measuring because they did not know how to measure their emissions. And so a key portion within the tourism industry is this relationship between businesses and providing services and the tourists themselves. And so traveler decision-making can play a role in developing a more sustainable industry. Where travelers put their money, who they invest in, can kind of be a guiding force when it comes to changes within the industry. And so one aspect of this traveler business connection is affording travelers the most up-to-date information to allow them to make the most conscious decision. However, we did find that for those that are measuring their emissions, almost half are not disclosing their greenhouse gas emissions. And when they are disclosing them, they're primarily disclosing them internally. So we're not seeing this transparency from businesses to travelers to allow for travelers to make the most conscious decision within their particular context. Next slide, please. And so similarly to certifications, goal setting has been found to support organizational efforts to reduce greenhouse gases. Our results suggest that organizations are setting emissions goals, primarily 2030 reduction targets. 43% of businesses and 37% of destinations have a 2030 reduction target. Which is a positive. That means that we are recognizing that emissions are connected to climate change, and that is a key avenue that we can address as an industry overall. And so for both businesses and destinations, half of the 2030 targets are a 50% or more reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So that is a really bold goal, but I think it's a goal that collectively, collaboratively, the tourism industry is pushing towards, which is a very positive thing when it comes to the outlook for climate change. Next slide, please. Importantly, with climate change, as the climate continues to change, adaptation largely revolves around building adaptive capacities. And so those adaptive capacities vary based on characteristics of an organization, including size, location, the industry focus itself, and the staffing availability that the organization has. Most of the utilized adaptation practices were technical and policy related adaptations. So technical being tangible, on the ground adaptation changes. So things like water harvesting, energy efficiencies, those kinds of things. And whereas policy related adaptations are a positive thing in that policies influence the future of the organization. So there is some level of forethought into adapting to climate change within the policies, regardless of if there's a plan or not. However, there are other aspects of an adaptive organization. So for example, organizations that reported having flexible policies were not accounting or taking or they weren't assessing future risks in their planning. So where their flexible policies makes them an adaptive organization, the concept that climate change will continue to get worse in the future, although they have flexible policies, not assessing future risks makes those policies more rigid. So there are aspects of adaptive organizations that were not taken into account, that were not reported by organizations. And so the majority of organizations that reported assessing existing risks and vulnerabilities to climate change were not reporting, or we're not assessing future risks. So there's this disconnect between the here and now of a business, which makes sense, right? We want businesses to be sustainable in the now, but there's also obviously with climate change and the future of climate change, as it continues to bleaken, it seems like those risks evolve really, and so we need to be assessing our change beyond that. One important practice in creating an adaptive organization is to engage stakeholders across multiple industries. If you'll change to the next slide, please. So climate change engagement in the tourism industry is obviously a multifaceted approach, right? It includes engagement with other organizations. So that can be similarly situated organizations in different industries. It involves engaging with staff members, so that includes training on climate change, taking into their expertise within the organizational policies and structure, and then engaging with your actual clients themselves. So those people that are traveling, getting them engaged with climate change. We see some organizations that are specifically focused on taking their travelers to places where climate change is impacting, which we see in other research that when people experience climate change, there is that is the start of a transformative experience to create more sustainable travelers overall. And so for organizational collaboration, we found that majority of organizations are not addressing climate change cooperatively with other organizations. So we outside of the plan, right, we're addressing climate change, but we're not doing it collaboratively, which the IPCC suggests that addressing climate change is really a synthesis of policy, of government, of industry, of research and education. And so we're not seeing the synthesis within the tourism industry. 2/3 of organizations reported not engaging their staff in trainings and other climate actions. So they're not going from these overarching policies into tangible on the ground actions through their staff. And then over 3/4 of organizations reported not engaging their visitors in climate change in climate actions. And so for me, that is one of the largest ways that engagement can improve. Each traveler that we have within the tourism industry has the ability to make a difference within our future. And so we are losing 75% of those travelers, really, if you, according to the organizations, we're losing 75% of those travelers that could be making a difference in climate change. So it's important to engage travelers. It's important to engage your staff, the tourism staff that are on the ground dealing with climate change on a day-to-day basis, as well as to collaborate with other organizations within your industry and aside from industry, something that I think UNWTO has done well as far as our collaborative efforts here for this study. And so engagement is a multifaceted thing that to me seems like one of the most pressing aspects that the tourism industry can address. Next slide. And for the way forward, I will pass it back over to Paige.
Thank you, Dan. That one's on me. Thank you so much.
Just kidding. Back to Virginia. We have too many. Everyone. We're just passing.
Exactly. It's an absolute pleasure to work with such a team. So, yeah, I mean, just thank you so much for running us so swiftly through all the takeaways. Thanks, Dan, Paige, and Christina. I wanted to take a moment before we move into the Q&A to basically highlight the main, let's say, recommendations that this baseline report is putting forward, and somehow connect them to, as I said in the intro, the work that we are pushing through the Glasgow Declaration. So there are basically 5 recommendations. The first one is related to the need for guidance on climate action. We know that there is likely much more climate action being led by tourism stakeholders than the one we could capture in this report. So raising awareness on what can actually fall inside climate action will most likely help stakeholders realize of the potential of many initiatives that they already have in place and which are supporting mitigation or adaptation efforts. We, as many of you know, need the guidance to develop climate plans, and we need that guidance to be tailored to the needs of smaller organizations, including those that don't have sustainability staff. We are trying to advance this work within the activities of the Glasgow Declaration, and we'll be continuing to brief you about the progress. Second point is regarding capacity building on measurement of emissions. We need to track emissions, let's say reliably tracking emissions reductions requires measurement, and yet measurement remains a challenge for all types of stakeholders. So really need to build knowledge on measurement methodologies and techniques, on how to define targets, and also understand or enhance the understanding of the mitigation potential of those ongoing activities that we have. For those of you who connected last week, we had a technical session on the overview of tools and methodologies, for which the paper is still undergoing a consultation, so don't hesitate to take a look at that piece of work. Third point is the importance of streamlined reporting mechanisms. We want to promote the disclosure of data on emissions, and we think that it needs to be supported through simplified processes and building on existing reporting platforms. We also were considering that it could seem strategic to maybe measure the numbers of changes in practices implemented by tourism stakeholders in connection to mitigation and adaptation efforts, in parallel to advancing the complex task of measuring the actual CO2 emissions implications. We believe that such approach could encourage action at scale, especially for those that are starting in the journey, and make every effort count. And the fourth recommendation is that we have an opportunity to, let's say, uptake carbon removal. We saw that the prevalence of offsetting is limited, whether it is through traditional offsetting or through more technological innovative approaches. So we feel there is an opportunity to promote investments from tourism into carbon removal and nature-based solutions. We would need carbon removals to ensure that net zero can be met. So maybe it's good to start thinking how we could support these technologies and approaches to speed up. And please note the disclaimer here that compensation of emissions shall be reserved for residual emissions, those left after implementing reduction efforts. And then the last bullet is on collaboration platforms. As Dan was explaining, we need to gain a further understanding of climate policy frameworks at country and regional level, and identifying opportunities for tourism to take part on those, and to support, let's say, encouraging that all relevant players are involved and that we can mobilize the necessary support. And at the business level, collaboration at the value chain would be essential to accelerate sustainable consumption and production in connection to climate action. Basically, with these 5 bullets, we have a lot of homework ahead of us, and we hope that we can continue collaborating with all of you and exchanging, so that we make these things happen. And with this, let's move into the questions and answers to hear your comments, your questions, your criticism. Everything is welcome in this forum. Please, if you want to intervene, kindly raise your hand, and then we will activate your mic. So who would like to go first? Or maybe
I'd like to go first. Can I break the ice?
You can, Christina, please go ahead.
I have. So Dan, I loved your presentation. There were a couple nuggets in there that like popped out to me immediately. Sorry for this. I know we had planned some questions, but you said something that I'd like to start with instead. So you talked a little bit about not seeing the transparency in emissions from businesses to travelers. And I think this opportunity to measure emissions not only for your business, but also so that you can share that emissions knowledge with your travelers so that they can then perhaps make different choices. We had a conference in Lugano a week ago, and one of the sessions, Dr. Milena Nikolova led it on behavioral science. How do you bring sort of what we know from behavioral science into this? And so she was offering these examples of how, if you put the more sustainable option at the top, you show different itineraries, but put the lower emission. Anyway, it was a really interesting conversation on that. And I wonder what, so this is something that came out in here, right? Like we see they're not measuring, and we also see that then we're kind of missing an opportunity to engage travelers. Did I say it all for you? Say more.
Well, yeah, I definitely think that there is a lack of transparency in emissions. So one, we see that a lot of organizations are not measuring at all, which I think is I think that's part of the issue, right? It's hard to be transparent about something you don't know. But at the same time, I think there is a lack of knowledge of how to measure organizational emissions. So things like scopes and things like that. I think it needs to be broader kind of recognition of methods to measure emissions. But then also, I think there probably needs to be some level of changing in perceptions of actual emissions themselves. Just because you're an emitter doesn't mean that you are inherently a
Like the
bad
stigma.
organization. Right. It
Right.
doesn't mean you're a bad
Mhm.
organization, but it means that there's progress to be made. Right. And so I think there could be some transparency in, saying, hey, we are trying to reduce our emissions. Do you as the traveler want to help us do that? Right. Like bringing travelers to engage with organizations in their progress, I think is only part of this transparency in this organizational emissions thing.
We don't have to be perfect. We just have to be
Right.
better than we were yesterday.
Yes,
So
sir.
the other in these respondents, can you comment on, I know we had so many different types of stakeholders, but organizational size, did we remind me, I think these are not the people who took time to complete the survey and shared a lot, I believe have a deep care in here, but some of we may have had smaller organizations that inherently are going to be more strapped. I think that's also interesting in the tourism context. We are, we're comprised of small and medium-sized businesses all around the world. That's part of our strength. But in this context, it's also one of the biggest challenges, right?
Yeah, for sure. The majority of our sample were small and medium enterprises. So organizations certainly less than 500 employees, but also majority were less than 100 employees. So we're talking about small organizations that I agree that probably have different resource allocations that can certainly impact their ability to address and adapt to climate change.
Right, like it's hard to have a climate expert in your lean, mean team. We had another question in here. I'm way off script, but I think you know this really well, about sustainability staff and the presence of sustainability staff. Share a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we found that sustainability staff, when you had staff, you are more likely to engage with climate action broadly. So either with a plan or without. There's some evidence to support that having sustainability staff, you're more likely to have a climate action plan, but it's that relationship. One, it's a very weak relationship, and two, it needs to be explored more in a broader sample. But it does seem to be that having sustainability staff, you're engaging in climate action more than those that do not have a sustainability staff, which makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I was listening to a podcast yesterday, Optimism and Outrage, and they were talking about how climate is one of the least funded from philanthropic investment. And it occurs to me that maybe one thing that comes out of this is, like, if you're a philanthropist and you want to support travel's transformation, help fund expertise and staffing. I see there's hands being raised. I can be quiet, and Virginia, you can moderate Q&A. I have a lot more if we get a gap.
So I was replying to Benjamin on the chat. Benjamin Carey, he was asking about the survey and proposing that we would, stressing the importance that we would have disseminated also the survey in other UN languages besides English, French and Spanish, like Arabic, Chinese and Russian. So basically I was agreeing with him that this would have been extremely important, for example, to trigger more responses from the Middle East, where we didn't collect that many, but we had too much let's say, the capacity of the team to work in those languages when we disseminated the questionnaires. So it was a bit of a limitation that we had to deal with. But yeah, of course, for next round, we hope it can be that way. I see one hand raised. Just give me a second. This would be Sylvia Nath.
Anna?
Sylvia, can you introduce yourself when we open your mic, and then start with your question, please?
Yeah.
You are on mute. Thanks, Virginia, and thanks everyone for a great presentation. I think I agree with Christina that there were so many nuggets there that popped out. So just a quick introduction. I'm Shivya. I'm a travel writer and a sustainable tourism consultant. And I'm currently working with a tour operator in the Asia Pacific region to calculate their carbon emissions, see how we can reduce them, and then design community-based offset. But we're also trying to build like climate awareness into their itinerary. So creating touch points where tourists can be engaged around conversations on climate change, but also be part of the offset that are being done as part of the trip. So I had a couple of questions. The first was that I think a sticky topic when it comes to tours is whether flights to destinations are considered a part of the the carbon footprint of the organization, or is that an onus that we pass on to the traveler themselves, which is largely what is happening. So I wondered if there was something in the survey that included that, or if you have any thoughts on that. And then the second question was around climate certifications. So is there something specific that you recommend organizations to look at, or are you just talking about like general GSTC kind of accredited certification?
Thank you, Sylvia. Colleagues, if you agree, I'll take the first one and maybe pass it on to you for certifications. The hot discussion on aviation and where we stand, we are actually exchanging on it because it's popping up in every meeting that we have. And from the last, let's say, group call, the understanding was that at a minimum, a tour operator who's selling the flights should be taking care of those emissions as part of the footprint. Having said this, there's no methodology so far which is, let's say, having wide consensus. So the discussion is ongoing to see how we can reasonably define the boundaries of emissions from one stakeholder in tourism to the next, because one, let's say, accommodation provider would have its premises under scope 1 and the energy purchase under its scope 2, but the whole hotel emissions would be the scope 3 of a tour operator. So we have, let's say, to be finding the balance between the boundaries, and that is in progress, Sylvia and colleagues. So I invite you to follow our discussions while we advance towards consensus, hopefully to produce soon. Dan, you want to take the one on certification?
Sure. Well, so first I just want to address that in the survey, we didn't specify certifications. So we were just wondering broadly, because this is kind of, again, a foundational survey, foundational study to understand where are we at currently. And so we just use the verbiage we used was sustainability certifications. And so we didn't look as if it were accredited or not. We were just wondering that how many people are getting certifications, period, which really should be followed up. There could be a whole nother, I mean, you could do a study on its own about certifications and accreditation. But as far as ones that, certifications that are kind of the gold standard are these accredited ones that are backed by science, to really just kind of avoid this concept of greenwashing in organizationals or in organizations' approach to climate change. That's one thing that I think is can be a slippery slope. If we say, hey, we really want to push towards a sustainable industry, that is obviously a phenomenal goal. I think it's a novel goal, but it's important to do it the right way and not just say, hey, let's just slap a green logo on this trip and say, yeah, we're certified. But if that certification doesn't have any backing to it, I think that's almost makes it pointless.
If I may add, I think though, the fact that there are so many certifications available and that people are doing them shows that they feel like it's something they can do. So folks are looking for ways to take action. So while there isn't one set certification, just the fact that people sign up for these certifications shows that they want to do something to affect a positive change.
Okay, let's see what other questions we have. I don't see many hands, but people are active on the chat. So I
The
will,
chat is blowing up.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and read the question from Destination Livingstone. I cannot see the full name. Okay, can we use the same measurement systems globally and get accurate figures in both developed and less developed countries and destinations? That's a good question, especially that the measurement of emissions at destination level is really tricky. And once more, no methodology has been, let's say, validated or globally consensuated. I would think that, so for the measurement systems, yes, I think the measurement systems are measuring emissions, and emissions are emissions no matter where you are in the world. And there is the greenhouse gas emissions protocol, which is basically the big book of how to measure emissions, which is let's say the methodology to divide the different emissions into scopes, with scope 1 being your direct emissions from vehicles and fuels that burnt on site, scope 2 being emissions from your purchased energy, and scope 3 emissions being those emissions in the value chain. Having said this is of global application. When it comes to a destination, there are much more layers to it. And we are discussing with our destination, for example, signatories of the Glasgow Declaration, where to start. And the recommendations is, at least for the moment, to first start measuring the emissions of your own organization, so that you are already integrating these, let's say, technical concepts, and then from there start getting bigger, then engage your industry, act as a multiplier, support those accommodation businesses and tour operators in your destination to see if they can measure, and you can somehow get some data and perspectives from them. And then for, let's say, advanced level, then think about the international sphere, if you have international aviation, etc. It's all again in discussion. So I know you're a signatory, so I invite you to thank you and invite you to continue debating with us, so that we can make sure that whatever we propose is ambitious, but at the same time realistic, yeah, for everyone to be able to implement.
Can I add to that real quick, Virginia?
Of course.
Yeah, I just want to say that, so that was one thing that we looked at that you can see in the full report, is measurement and the actual methodologies that people used, that organizations use to measure their emissions. And so since we do have a kind of global recognition, or a global response, there will be some kind of layers to that. But I do think that is somewhere that is needing more research and education, is this difference between developing countries and developed countries, and measuring emissions between those, because emissions don't care where you're from, like you said, Virginia. So yeah.
I have a,
Christina, please go ahead.
yeah, well, I'm thinking about sort of takeaways and what do we do from all this? And one of the aspects that has struck me is these knowledge gaps that have shown up. So the knowledge gap of measurement. I love, this finding that many organizations are focused on energy efficiencies and on reductions. One of the gaps for me, of course, was on removals, on carbon removal and understanding not only do we need to reduce emissions, but we are going to also have to use a variety of methods to help clean up the trillions of tons of stored CO2. What are some of the big knowledge gaps that you think we can look at to solve, like people can walk away and go, because I don't think any organization is going to be able to do all the full spectrum, right? So all of us are going to specialize and chip in. What do you have some other opportunities there in terms of education that popped out for you?
Yeah. So for me, so obviously just knowledge about measurement is obviously clear that there's a need for that. There's certainly a knowledge gap between the differences in carbon removal versus carbon offsetting, those kinds of things. That is, and that your organization is working hard to address for sure. But then again, I think that for me, the main thing is this engagement aspect. We can't address climate change by ourselves. We can't. If we're all on different pages on how we address climate change, then we're never going to get to this kind of sustainable approach that we're looking for, right? And so I think there needs to be more education about how can we engage travelers in not this, oppressive way in engaging with climate change, and how do we address climate change together from the destination side, from just beyond the organizational or the governmental hierarchy of national, subnational, local, into looking and partnering with industry, partnering with other industries, education, academia, and using the resources that are available to us. We don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? There are resources to be used that I think through collaboration across industries, we're able to use and to adapt to a changing future, right? I mean, we're going to have to adapt. Tourism must adapt. That's not a question. It's just a matter of how. And to me, collaboration is the biggest knowledge gap that we have, is collaboration.
Collaboration is so time consuming.
It is time
Like
consuming.
how do we find time to talk to each other?
Well,
I see another.
Basically, you just join the Glasgow Declaration and we
That's
praise
right.
you.
I do want to add, because one of the findings was that destinations are collaborating more to address climate change, where businesses were really trying to work by themselves to take action. And as Dan pointed out, it really takes a synthesis of business and industry and, partners like UNWTO working together. And, without that collaboration, we're all working harder, not smarter. So it makes sense for us to work collectively among all sectors.
Yeah, absolutely. Colleagues, we just have like 1-2 minutes left, so I don't think we will be managing all the questions, but rapidly from glancing, Mark W was asking about or highlighting the need for calculators, and also stating how expensive this whole exercise is and when is funding gonna come. We have my colleague Roxana, thank you so much, has pasted in the chat the link to the latest paper on tools for measuring, which is under consultation. So I'll invite you to take a look at that. If you have comments, maybe share them. I hope you find useful things with regards to funding. It's really challenging, but unless we speak with one voice, it's going to continue be pockets here, pockets there, but the sector, let's say, not necessarily front and center at the table of any climate negotiation. So if we are aligned and we all follow more or less a consistent framework, I think our voice will have more weight when these issues are to be discussed in state politics. And then let's see what else we can glance through. Colleagues, help me here if you saw something.
I saw Lisa from Finland. I recognize she had her hand up. Lisa, do you want to ask your question in the final minutes?
Exactly, that would be the final intervention. Lisa, please.
We have to figure out how to unmute you, but we're going to do it.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
We can, yes.
Yeah. I had my hand raised for a little while. It's been really interesting conversation. So actually, it was to the previous topic that the carbon removal is, of course, like a huge discussion, especially in developed countries. But for example, like here in Finland, like usual carbon removal is something like something with the forest, something to do with the land. But it's already counted somewhere else. And I think that's the case, at least in all the EU countries. So it would be actually double counting. So you can't reduce your carbon footprint by investing, for example, in reforestation. So you would actually have to compensate somewhere else, but they're quite questionable that if you are then participating in some compensation project, you don't really necessarily have any kind of like a way of overseeing that, whether the compensation actually really happens and whether it actually really leads to some decarbonization. So actually, I just wanted to bring to the topic that what about like instead of like compensating after all the reductions are done that you possibly can't, because we're talking about small businesses that already have fairly small carbon footprint. So what about like a charity investments, or for example investing in research that leads to carbon removal?
Yeah.
But that doesn't reduce your carbon footprint, and because it's not counted at the moment, it's not encouraging businesses and destinations to do so.
It's very relevant. The WWF published a paper, I think it's called Beyond Science-Based Targets, and they break down the compensation, the value of compensating your emissions, and also the value of contributing, and the fact that, and they're both okay and welcome strategies and can exist in the same business. So you may have a lane of things that you're doing to compensate your emissions, and you may also have a lane of things that you're doing to contribute to the scale up or the build up or the improvement of solutions that we need in the future. So I think the contributing to carbon removal charities, if you like to say, or strategies, whatever, those are all great things. And what has sort of held people back is just being single-minded on compensation. And so your point is very well taken. You can have a suite of things that you're doing for compensation, and you can also be contributing. I know Virginia's gonna cut us down.
Yes, it's a pity because it's a very interesting discussion, and definitely, Lisa, thanks for pointing that out for our follow-ups. And I'd like to thank everyone for the interest. It's been great. Thanks to the team on the screen. Thanks also to Roxana Stari for their support in the backstage. And please stay tuned. We will have more technical sessions, and don't hesitate to share your feedback with us. The report, the baseline report, if we could put up the slide, is accessible online, and we are giving the possibility to receive more comments in the next couple of weeks. So if something was unanswered, if you want to make a comment, just go on that website and check and tell us your thoughts. We like participatory approaches, so please do so. And with the video of the Glasgow Declaration, we will close the session, hoping that you will soon join us. Thank you.
Thanks, Virginia.
Thank you, Virginia.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.